What would you do if your estranged multimillionaire father died and left his entire sprawling estate to a cruel stepmother, leaving you with absolutely nothing but a rusted, oil-leaking 1989 Chevy Caprice? You'd probably feel deeply humiliated. You'd probably think it was a final, vindictive joke from the grave. That's exactly what Jack thought as he slept freezing in the backseat of that very car, bankrupt and recently evicted. But the dead don't tell jokes. They leave clues. And when Jack smashed the dashboard in a fit of absolute freezing despair, what tumbled out of the ventilation shaft didn't just rewrite his family's history, it exposed a massive, calculated lie that almost cost him his life. The mahogany walls of Victor Sterling's law office in downtown Pittsburgh felt less like a sanctuary of justice and more like an execution chamber. Jack Stellan sat in a high-backed leather chair that was entirely too comfortable for the occasion. His hands, rough and stained with the grease of 100 failed attempts to keep his small logistics startup afloat, rested awkwardly on his knees. Across from him sat Brianna. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored, somber black dress that probably cost more than Jack had made in the last 3 months. Her eyes were dry, though she occasionally dabbed at them with a monogrammed handkerchief for the benefit of the attorney. Next to her lounged Trent, her biological son, and Jack's stepbrother. Trent wore a custom navy pinstripe suit, his ankle resting casually on his knee, revealing silk socks. He looked like a man waiting to collect lottery winnings, not a son mourning a father. Ryland Stellan had been a giant of a man, a steel and manufacturing magnate who built an empire from the rust and grit of the Ohio Valley. He was also a man who, over the last 15 years, had been meticulously alienated from his only biological son. Brianna had seen to that. A misplaced word here, a fabricated story of Jack's disrespect there, and slowly, the chasm between Jack and Ryland had grown too wide to cross. Jack hadn't spoken to his father in 3 years when the call came about the fatal heart attack. "We are gathered here to execute the final will and testament of Ryland Arthur Stellan," Victor Sterling announced, his voice a practiced, monotone drone that echoed in the quiet room. He adjusted his half-moon spectacles and broke the wax seal on the heavy parchment envelope. Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't expecting millions. He knew the relationship was fractured. But his startup was drowning in debt, his apartment was 2 months behind on rent, and his fiancée had packed her bags 3 weeks ago, unable to handle the financial freefall. A small piece of his father's estate, even a token sum, could save Jack from total ruin. Sterling began to read. The distribution was systematic and brutal. "To my wife, Brianna Carmichael Stellan, I leave the primary estate in Fox Chapel, the summer home in Nantucket, and 51% of all voting shares in Stellan Manufacturing." Brianna let out a soft, theatrical sigh, bowing her head. Trent smirked, tracing the edge of his jaw with his index finger. "To my stepson, Trent Carmichael, I leave the remaining 49% of voting shares, the penthouse in Manhattan, and the liquid assets held in the Cayman Trust to be managed at his discretion." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. The entire empire, the homes, the cash, the legacy, all handed over to the two people who had systematically dismantled Ryland's life and isolated him from his real family. Jack's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. And finally, Sterling continued, clearing his throat and looking up at Jack with a fleeting glance of what might have been pity. "To my biological son, Jack Stellan." Jack leaned forward. The room went dead silent. Sterling looked back down at the document. The will reads as follows. "To my son Jack, who always insisted he could navigate the difficult roads of life on his own terms without my help, I leave my 1989 Chevrolet Caprice Classic, currently stored in the secondary facility at the industrial park. May it get you exactly where you need to go." Silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. Jack stared at the lawyer, waiting for the rest of it. A trust fund, a modest cash sum, a watch, anything. Is that it?" Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm afraid so, Mr. Stellan," Sterling replied softly, closing the folder. "The rest of the estate is tied up in the aforementioned trusts and properties." A sharp, short laugh erupted from Trent. He tried to muffle it with his hand, but the cruelty in his eyes was blindingly clear. "A 1989 Chevy. Classic dad. Always knew you had a passion for junk, Jack." "Trent, please," Brianna murmured, though the corner of her mouth twitched upward. "Jack, I know this must be disappointing. Your father was complicated at the end. His mind wasn't entirely what it used to be, but we must respect his final wishes." Jack stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. If he opened his mouth, he would scream. He turned and walked out of the opulent office, the heavy wooden doors shutting behind him with a final, decisive thud. He was completely, utterly ruined. The secondary storage facility was a bleak, corrugated metal warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with rusted barbed wire. Jack handed the legal paperwork to the sleepy security guard, who pointed him toward bay number 4. When Jack rolled up the aluminum door, a cloud of dust and the sharp smell of mildew and stale oil greeted him. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was the inheritance, the 1989 Chevrolet Caprice Classic. It was a monstrosity of faded burgundy paint and peeling faux wood paneling. The rear bumper was slightly detached, hanging lazily on the left side. The tires were half deflated, and a dark, viscous puddle of oil stained the concrete beneath the engine block. Jack walked around it, running a hand over the cold, dusty hood. His father had bought this car used decades ago, for a reason Jack could no longer remember. Why had he kept it? Why had he left it to him? May it get you exactly where you need to go, Jack muttered to himself, echoing the will. Where am I going, Dad? Over a cliff? Using a portable air compressor he'd brought in a backpack, Jack managed to inflate the tires enough to make them roadworthy. He popped the hood, checked the muddy brown oil, hooked up a jumper pack to the corroded battery terminals, and turned the key. The engine cranked sluggishly whir, before coughing violently and roaring to life with a deafening rattle. A plume of thick gray smoke choked the garage. The engine knocked terribly. A rhythmic, metallic tapping that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Driving the Caprice out of the warehouse was an exercise in pure misery. The suspension squeaked over every pebble, and the steering wheel had about 4 inches of dead play in either direction. But the physical discomfort of the car was nothing compared to the reality waiting for Jack back in the city. When he arrived at his apartment building in the fading twilight, he found a neon orange notice taped to his door. Notice of eviction. Locks changed. Jack stood in the hallway, staring at the brass padlock securing his life away from him. He had known it was coming, but the finality of it hit him like a physical blow. His bank accounts were overdrawn by hundreds of dollars. His credit cards were maxed out, he had no family left to call, and his pride wouldn't allow him to beg his former friends who had all drifted away during his financial downward spiral for a couch to sleep on. He walked back out to the street. The heavy gray clouds above Pittsburgh finally broke, unleashing a torrent of freezing, miserable November rain. Jack unlocked the creaking door of the Caprice, slid onto the worn, cracked vinyl of the front seat, and closed the door. The sound of the rain drumming on the metal roof was deafening. For the first time since he received the news of his father's death, Jack broke down. He rested his forehead against the large plastic steering wheel and wept. He wept for the loss of his father, for the theft of his legacy, for the failure of his business, and for the absolute crushing reality of his present moment. For the next 2 weeks, the Chevy Caprice became Jack's entire world. He was homeless. He parked in the dimly lit corners of 24-hour grocery store parking lots or nestled between abandoned buildings in the industrial district to avoid the police. He learned the harsh routines of living in a vehicle, washing his face and brushing his teeth in the grimy sinks of gas station bathrooms, eating cheap canned soup cold, and sleeping curled up in the backseat beneath a thin, moth-eaten blanket he found in the trunk. The car was actively fighting him too. The transmission slipped terrifyingly when shifting from first to second gear. The driver's side window wouldn't roll up the last 2 inches, letting in a constant draft of freezing wind. Jack was cold all the time. A deep, bone-chilling cold that settled in his joints and made his teeth chatter uncontrollably through the long, dark nights. He spent his days at the public library, desperately applying for any job he could find: warehouse work, data entry, night shift janitorial duties. But his worn appearance and exhausted demeanor didn't interview well. Every rejection chipped away at the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He began to deeply, fiercely hate his father. Ryland Stellan hadn't just abandoned him in life. He had reached from beyond the grave to ensure Jack suffered. One evening, as a brutal winter storm rolled into the valley, bringing a mix of sleet and snow, Jack sat parked behind a closed strip mall. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, plunging into the low 20s. Jack was shivering violently, his breath pluming in the dark cabin of the Caprice. "Come on," Jack begged, his voice trembling. He turned the key, praying the battery had enough juice left. The engine sputtered and caught, roaring with its familiar, ugly knock. Jack immediately slammed the climate control lever all the way to the right, demanding maximum heat. He waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing. Only a pathetic, wheezing stream of ice-cold air blew from the vents. The heater core had finally given out. Jack stared at the vents, feeling the freezing air hit his face. The sheer unfairness of it all boiled up inside him. The betrayal by Brianna, the smug look on Trent's face, the cold, the hunger, the utter humiliation of this rusted metal box. The anger erupted like a volcano. "You son of a bitch," Jack screamed at the empty car. "You left me to die in this piece of garbage." He balled his fist and swung wildly in the dark. He slammed his knuckles directly into the hard, brittle plastic of the dashboard right above the glove compartment and the center air vents. Crack. The 30-year-old plastic, weakened by decades of sun and cold, shattered completely. A large, jagged piece of the dashboard broke inward, leaving a gaping, black hole of exposed wires and ventilation ducting. Jack immediately pulled his hand back, his knuckles bleeding and stinging. He sat there, chest heaving, listening to the engine rattle and the freezing wind howl through the broken window. He had just destroyed the only shelter he had left. "Stupid," he whispered, wiping a mixture of tears and dirt from his face. "Stupid, stupid, stupid." He reached out to pull the sharp, hanging shards of plastic away, afraid they would cut him if he shifted in his sleep. As he shoved his hand into the dark cavity of the broken dashboard, past the rigid plastic tubing of the broken AC vents, his fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It wasn't a wire, it wasn't a fuse box, it felt soft but heavy. Frowning, Jack ignored the bleeding on his knuckles and pushed his arm deeper into the freezing hollow of the dashboard. His fingers hooked around a dense, rectangular object. It was wedged tight between the firewall and the back of the glove box. He yanked hard, it didn't budge. He braced his feet against the floorboards and pulled with all his strength. With the sound of tearing adhesive, the object broke free. Jack tumbled backwards slightly, pulling his prize out into the dim light of the cabin. Jack turned on the overhead dome light. It flickered weakly, casting a pale yellow glow over his lap. Sitting on his legs was a package roughly the size of a thick dictionary. It was entirely wrapped in layers of heavy-duty, silver duct tape that had yellowed and dried at the edges with age. Dust and dead spiders clung to the sticky residue. It was heavy at least 5 or 6 pounds. Jack's heart began to race, a strange, nervous energy cutting through the freezing cold. Why would a brick of tape be hidden deep inside the dashboard of a worthless car? He dug into his pocket and pulled out his keys, using the sharp edge of his apartment key, a key to a door he could no longer open, to saw through the tough fibers of the tape. It took several minutes of frantic cutting and peeling. He tore the tape away in long gray strips, revealing a secondary layer of thick, watertight plastic. He sliced through that, too. Inside was a weathered, dark brown leather messenger bag. It smelled distinctly of his father, a mix of expensive cedar cologne and old paper. Jack's hands were shaking as he unbuckled the brass straps and opened the flap. He reached inside. The first thing he pulled out was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. Jack opened it. The pages were filled with his father's precise, angular handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a complex web of financial records, but not the kind Stellan Manufacturing kept on their public books. Jack scanned the columns. They were lists of offshore routing numbers, accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Next to each account number were dates stretching back over 12 years and massive numerical figures. Millions of dollars. Beside the figures were initials B, C, and GC Brianna Carmichael, and GC. Jack reached back into the bag. He pulled out a heavy antique brass key. It was long and ornate, the kind used for private, high-security safety deposit boxes in older banks. Stamped into the metal were the numbers 804. Next, he pulled out a micro-cassette tape, the kind used in old dictation machines. It had a small white label on it. Written in red ink was one word: listen. Finally, Jack reached into the very bottom of the bag and pulled out a photograph. It was a Polaroid, the colors slightly washed out, but the image perfectly clear. Jack stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was Brianna. She looked a decade younger, her hair styled differently, but the cold, calculating eyes were exactly the same. She was standing in front of a rusted chain-link fence, the exact same type of fence that surrounded the storage facility where Jack had picked up the Caprice. But it wasn't just Brianna. Standing next to her, his arm wrapped intimately around her waist, was a man. He wasn't Ryland Stellan. Jack recognized the face instantly. It was Gregory Collins. Gregory was his father's former chief financial officer, a man who had abruptly resigned and vanished from Pittsburgh under mysterious circumstances about 8 years ago. In the photograph, Gregory was holding a sleek silver Halliburton briefcase, and at their feet, resting against the fence, was a heavy steel shovel, its blade caked in dark, wet mud. Jack stared at the photo, then at the ledger, and then at the brass key. His mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. The cold wind blowing through the window was entirely forgotten. The adrenaline surging through his veins made him feel burning hot. His father hadn't lost his mind. His father hadn't left him the caprice as a final insult. Ryland Stellan knew. He knew he was surrounded by vipers. He knew Brianna and Gregory were siphoning millions out of his empire. And he knew that if he left his real money to Jack in the will, Brianna's high-priced lawyers would contest it, freeze the assets, and drag Jack through courts until he was ruined. The car was a Trojan horse. Brianna saw a piece of worthless junk and laughed. She didn't know that parked in that secondary storage facility was the map, the evidence, and the key to dismantling everything she had stolen. Jack looked at the bleeding knuckles on his right hand, then down at the ledger in his lap. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face, the first time he had smiled in months. "Okay, Dad," Jack whispered into the cold darkness of the car, gripping the brass key tightly in his fist. Message received. Now we play my game. He had no money, no home, and no allies. But Jack Stellan suddenly had the one thing that terrified people like Brianna Carmichael more than anything else in the world. He had the truth, and he was going to use it to burn her stolen empire to the ground. The morning sun offered light, but absolutely no warmth as it crested over the Pittsburgh skyline. Jack sat in the driver's seat of the ruined Caprice, his breath frosting the windshield. He had the ledger, the photo, and the brass key resting on the passenger seat, but the microcassette tape burned a hole in his palm. He needed to hear it. He needed to hear his father's voice. But a microcassette was practically an ancient artifact in the modern world. His smartphone was useless here. Driven by a frantic, nervous energy, Jack spent the next hour tearing the interior of the Caprice apart. He shoved his hands deep into the crevices of the sticky vinyl seats, pulled up the heavy, stained floor mats, and rummaged through the ashtrays. He amassed a small, grimy pile of forgotten wealth. Quarters, dimes, a few nickels, and a crumpled, grease-stained $5 bill wedged beneath the spare tire in the trunk. It totaled exactly $14.85. He drove the knocking, smoking Chevy to a sprawling thrift store on the industrial outskirts of the city. The store smelled of mothballs and old dust. Jack practically ran to the electronics section in the back, scanning the shelves of discarded appliances. Sitting between a broken toaster and a stack of scratched CDs was a bulky, silver Panasonic dictaphone. The price tag, written in faded red marker, read $8. Jack bought it along with a fresh pack of AA batteries from the front counter, dumping his handfuls of sticky change onto the glass. Back in the freezing isolation of the car, Jack snapped the batteries into the recorder. His hands were trembling so badly he dropped the microcassette twice before finally clicking it into the deck. He pressed play. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the loud, rhythmic hiss of static tape. Jack closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the headrest. And then, cutting through the white noise, a voice spoke. Jack. Jack's eyes snapped open. It was his father, but he didn't sound like the booming, indomitable titan of industry Jack remembered. He sounded frail. He sounded breathless. He sounded like a man who knew he was running out of time. If you're hearing this, it means I'm dead. It also means you actually kept the car. I was terrified you'd send it straight to the scrapyard. If you did, then Brianna has already won. But if you're listening to this, then you found my failsafe. And I am so sorry, son. Jack swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He stared at the tape deck as it spun, hanging on to every raspy syllable. I know you hate me. I know you think I abandoned you for Brianna and Trent. The truth is, I was trying to protect you from them. About 4 years ago, I started noticing discrepancies in the quarterly logistics reports. Small things at first. A missing $50,000 here, a padded vendor invoice there. I dug into it quietly. What I found was a massive, systemic embezzlement ring operating right under my nose. The tape crackled. A heavy fit of coughing interrupted the recording. Jack clutched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't just Brianna, Ryland's voice continued. Weaker now. It was Gregory Collins, my trusted CFO, my best friend. They were lovers, Jack. They have been for over a decade. Trent isn't even a Carmichael. He's Gregory's biological son, They orchestrated a massive siphon, pulling millions out of Stellan manufacturing and washing it through offshore accounts in the Caymans. Jack looked down at the ledger on the seat. The initials B, C, and G. C. It all made sickening sense now. When I finally gathered enough evidence to confront Gregory privately, he vanished. The very next day, Brianna played the hysterical colleague perfectly. The police assumed Gregory fled the country to avoid an SEC audit. He didn't. They faked his disappearance. He's still stateside, pulling the strings from the shadows while Brianna plays the dutiful wife. I was going to turn them into the FBI, Jack. But then, my heart started failing. Faster than the doctors predicted. Another pause. The static hissed loudly. I am entirely convinced Brianna has been tampering with my medication, slowly poisoning me. But I couldn't prove it, and I was too weak to fight them openly. They own the board of directors now. If I had left you the company in my will, they would have tied you up in litigation for decades, frozen your assets, and destroyed you. They despise you, Jack, because you are the only real Stellan left. I had to let them think they won. I had to play the senile, manipulated old man. Tears tracked hot paths down Jack's freezing cheeks. His father hadn't abandoned him. He was a prisoner in his own empire, trying to shield his son from the blast radius. The ledger you found documents every stolen dime. The photograph proves their collusion after Gregory supposedly disappeared, but you need capital to fight them. The brass key belongs to box 804 at the Liberty Independent Vaults in Philadelphia. Everything you need to bury them is inside that box. Do not trust the police yet, Jack. They have judges and detectives on their payroll. You have to be smarter than them. You have to be ruthless. Take back what is yours. Avenge me. I love you, son. I always have. The tape clicked. The static stopped. The silence in the car was deafening. Jack sat motionless for a long time. The freezing wind howling through the broken window didn't register anymore. The hunger gnawing at his stomach had vanished. The crushing depression that had kept him paralyzed for weeks evaporated, replaced by something entirely different. It was pure, white-hot, concentrated rage. He had been homeless. He had been starving. He had believed he was utterly worthless. And all the while, Brianna and Trent were drinking champagne in his father's house, laughing at the stupid biological son freezing to death in a junked car. Jack reached out and turned the ignition. The Caprice rattled and roared to life. He threw the car into drive, ignoring the terrifying clunk of the transmission. He wasn't going back to the library. He wasn't going back to the grocery store parking lot. He pointed the hood of the rusted Chevy east. He was going to Philadelphia. The drive across Pennsylvania was a waking nightmare. The Caprice's broken heater meant Jack was exposed to the brutal, freezing temperatures for the entire 5-hour journey. He drove with the moth-eaten blanket wrapped securely around his shoulders, his teeth chattering so violently he thought they might crack. The engine temperature gauge danced dangerously close to the red line the entire way, and the smell of burning oil filled the cabin. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He pulled into Philadelphia just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent. The Liberty Independent Vaults were located in the basement of a massive, imposing pre-war building in the financial district. Its facade was carved from heavy gray limestone, adorned with brass fixtures that gleamed under the streetlights. Jack parked the sputtering Caprice a block away, acutely aware of how absurd the car looked parked next to sleek Mercedes and BMWs. He caught his reflection in a storefront window. He looked like a vagrant. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, a dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw, and there were deep purple bags under his eyes. He walked into the lobby of the depository. The floors were polished Italian marble, and the air smelled of expensive floor wax and money. A security guard in a tailored suit immediately stood up from his desk, eyeing Jack with overt suspicion. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, blocking the path to the heavy steel doors in the back. The unspoken "you don't belong here" hung thickly in the air. Jack straightened his spine. He channeled every ounce of his father's arrogant, aristocratic confidence he could muster. "I need to access my deposit box. Box 804. The guard frowned. "Sir, this is a private facility. You need an appointment, and I have my key," Jack interrupted, holding up the heavy brass key. The guard's eyes flicked to the number 804 stamped on the metal. His demeanor shifted slightly. Those keys were notoriously difficult to counterfeit. "Name? Jack Stellan. The account is under the Rylan A. Stellan Trust." The guard typed something into an iPad. A moment later, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Stellan. Please present your identification to Simon at the main desk." Jack walked past the guard to a large mahogany desk where an older, impeccably groomed man sat behind a sheet of bulletproof glass. Jack slid his crumpled driver's license under the slot, along with the brass key. Simon inspected both meticulously, compared Jack's face to the ID, and then nodded. "Right this way, Mr. Stellan." Simon led Jack through a set of heavy steel doors and down a carpeted hallway into the vault itself. It was a massive room lined floor to ceiling with brushed steel boxes. Simon used his master key in the left lock of box 804, and Jack inserted his brass key into the right. They turned them simultaneously. Click. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside rested a large black steel lockbox. Simon pulled it out and carried it to a private, windowless viewing room containing only a desk, a chair, and a brass lamp. "I will leave you to your business, sir." "Press the buzzer on the desk when you are finished," Simon said, bowing slightly before exiting and closing the heavy door behind him. Jack stood alone in the quiet room. He walked over to the desk, his hands shaking once again. He unlatched the two heavy clasps on the front of the black box and flipped the lid open. He stopped breathing. The box was packed to the brim with stacks of $100 bills. They were wrapped tightly in crisp purple bank bands. $10,000 a stack. Jack quickly counted them. 25 stacks. $250,000 in untraceable liquid cash. But the money wasn't the most valuable thing in the box. Resting on top of the stacks of cash was a thick manila envelope and a silver USB flash drive. Jack tore the envelope open. It was a comprehensive dossier compiled by a high-end private investigator. Jack flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. His father hadn't just suspected Gregory Collins was alive, he had tracked him down. Gregory was living in a gated luxury compound in Boca Raton, Florida, under the alias Gordon Cross. The dossier contained high-definition surveillance photos of Gregory tanned, relaxed, and wealthy meeting with Brianna at a private airstrip in Georgia just 3 months ago. There were copies of wire transfer receipts showing exactly how Brianna was funneling money from Stellan Manufacturing's operational budget directly into a shell corporation owned by Gordon Cross. And finally, at the bottom of the envelope was a signed, notarized affidavit from a low-level accountant named Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur confessed to doctoring the books under direct threats from Gregory and Brianna. He detailed the exact methods they used to hide the theft. It was a kill shot. It was absolute, undeniable proof of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Jack slowly lowered the documents onto the desk. A profound sense of calm washed over him. The panicked, desperate victim who had smashed his hand into the dashboard of a broken car was gone. In his place stood a man with a weapon, a war chest, and a burning desire to execute his father's final wish. He didn't take all the cash. He packed 5 stacks, $50,000 into his pockets, along with the USB drive and the PI's dossier. He locked the black box, returned it to the vault, and walked out of the Liberty Independent vaults with his head held high. His first stop was a luxury hotel just 3 blocks away. He walked up to the marble reception desk, ignoring the horrified looks of the concierge, and dropped $500 bills onto the counter. "The penthouse suite. Cash. And I need it immediately," Jack said, his voice hard and flat. An hour later, Jack stood under the scalding hot water of a rain shower. He scrubbed his skin until it was red, washing away the grease of the caprice, the grime of the streets, and the lingering stench of his own failure. He shaved the thick stubble from his face, applied expensive lotion provided by the hotel, and stepped out into the suite. Using the hotel's expedited concierge service, he had a tailor deliver a sharp, charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of polished black Oxfords directly to his room. When Jack stood in front of the full-length mirror, he barely recognized himself. The desperate, broken man was gone. Staring back at him was the spitting image of Rylan Arthur Stellan in his prime. He walked over to the suite's large mahogany desk and opened the sleek new laptop he had also ordered. He plugged the silver USB drive into the port. The drive contained digital backups of everything in the physical dossier, plus something else. A list of personal phone numbers for every single member of the Stellan Manufacturing Board of Directors. Jack picked up his new, untraceable burner phone. He wasn't going to the police. Not yet. If he went to the authorities now, Brianna's high-priced legal team would tie it up in court for years, claiming the documents were forged. No, Jack was going to do this his father's way. He was going to corner the rats. He found the number for the chairman of the board, a notoriously ruthless businessman named Franklin Sterling, the older brother of the lawyer who had read the will. Jack dialed the number and listened to it ring. "Hello?" a gruff voice answered. Franklin, Jack said, his voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. It's Jack Stellan. Jack? Franklin sounded irritated. Listen, kid, I heard about the will. I'm sorry, but there's nothing the board can do. Brianna has the voting shares. Don't call this number again. I'm not calling for a handout, Franklin, Jack replied smoothly, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. I'm calling to let you know that Brianna Carmichael and Gregory Collins have been embezzling from the company for 12 years. I have the Cayman routing numbers, the shell company documents, and surveillance photos of Gregory living in Florida. Silence fell over the line. Heavy, suffocating silence. Gregory is dead, Franklin finally whispered. Gregory is sipping margaritas in Boca Raton under the name Gordon Cross, Jack countered sharply. And if you don't want the SEC freezing every asset Stellan Manufacturing possesses by Friday morning, you are going to arrange an emergency, closed-door board meeting tomorrow night. Just the board and Brianna. You can't prove any of this. I'm emailing you a single photograph and one wire transfer receipt right now, Jack said, hitting send on the laptop. He waited 10 seconds. He heard a sharp intake of breath over the phone. My God, Franklin breathed. Tomorrow night, Franklin, 9 p.m., in my father's old boardroom, Jack commanded. And Franklin, make sure Trent is there too. I wouldn't want my stepbrother to miss the show. Jack hung up the phone and tossed it onto the bed. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. Tomorrow, he would walk into the lion's den, and he was going to burn it to the ground. The drive back to Pittsburgh was a stark contrast to the desperate, freezing journey the day before. Jack had $50,000 in crisp hundreds sitting on the passenger seat of the sputtering 1,989 Chevy Caprice, wrapped in the hotel's complimentary laundry bag. He could have easily bought a plane ticket or rented a luxury sedan, but that wasn't the point. His father had used this rusted, dilapidated car as the ultimate Trojan horse, and Jack was going to ride it right through the front doors of the Empire. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the Caprice limped into the pristine, underground executive parking garage of Stellan Manufacturing. The security gate, usually manned by a strict attendant, had been left open on Franklin Sterling's direct orders. The Caprice's engine knocked and wheezed, leaking a fresh trail of dark oil across the polished concrete. Jack bypassed the visitor parking and pulled the monstrous burgundy boat straight into the space marked Reserved, Chief Executive Officer. He killed the engine. The car shuddered violently before falling silent. Jack stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal gray suit. He grabbed the heavy leather messenger bag containing the physical ledgers, the flash drive, and a stack of freshly printed dossiers, and walked toward the private executive elevator. The 82nd floor boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Pittsburgh skyline, the city lights reflecting off the massive 50-foot mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. When Jack walked through the double glass doors, the atmosphere inside was so tense it felt like the air itself was vibrating. 7 members of the board of directors sat around the table, their expressions a mix of profound annoyance and deep anxiety. At the far end of the table sat Brianna. She was dressed in a sleek, designer black pantsuit, a string of understated pearls resting against her collarbone, the perfect picture of a grieving, yet stoic, widow. Next to her, Trent was leaning back in his chair, tapping a solid gold pen against his phone, looking entirely bored by the inconvenience of a late-night meeting. Franklin Sterling stood at the head of the table, his face pale, a sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. "What is the meaning of this, Franklin?" Brianna demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "You call an emergency meeting at 9 o'clock on a Thursday, refuse to provide an agenda, and now we are sitting here waiting for..." She stopped dead. The double doors closed shut behind Jack with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Brianna's eyes darted to him. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing absolute shock, before her features hardened into a mask of pure condescension. Trent stopped tapping his pen, sitting up slightly, his brow furrowing as he took in Jack's appearance. This wasn't the broken, ragged man they had laughed out of the lawyer's office. Jack looked lethal. He looked exactly like Ryland Stellan. "How did you get past security?" Trent sneered, recovering his bravado. "This is a restricted floor, Jack. The homeless shelter is 3 blocks down." Jack ignored him. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the head of the table. Franklin, trembling slightly, stepped aside, yielding the floor. Jack dropped the heavy leather bag onto the mahogany surface. The dull thud echoed through the silent room. "Good evening, Brianna." Trent, gentlemen of the board, Jack said, his voice calm, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know it's late, so I will be entirely direct. You have no right to be here, Brianna hissed, standing up. She looked at Franklin. Have security remove him immediately. If he refuses, call the police and have him arrested for trespassing. I wouldn't do that, Brianna, Jack replied smoothly, unbuckling the leather bag. Unless you want the police here when I finish my presentation. Presentation? Trent laughed. A harsh, mocking sound. What are you going to present, Jack? A business plan for a hot dog stand? You own nothing. My mother holds 51% of the voting shares. She owns this room. She owns you. Jack pulled out 7 thick, bound folders and slid them across the polished wood to each of the board members. He didn't give one to Brianna or Trent. What you have just been handed, Jack addressed the board, keeping his eyes locked on Brianna, is a comprehensive forensic accounting of Stellan Manufacturing's operational budget over the last 12 years. You will find detailed routing numbers, shell company registrations, and wire transfer receipts that completely bypass our internal auditing protocols. The board members opened the folders hesitantly. Papers rustled. Jack, this is absurd, Brianna said, though her voice wavered slightly. She forced a sympathetic smile looking at the board. Gentlemen, please. My stepson is clearly suffering a mental breakdown due to his financial insolvency. Ryland's death has unhinged him. We shouldn't humor this. Turn to page 4, Franklin. Jack instructed, his tone turning to ice. Franklin flipped the page. He swallowed hard. This is an affidavit. Signed and notarized yesterday by Arthur Penhaligon, Jack confirmed. A mid-level accountant in our logistics division. Arthur has provided a sworn confession detailing exactly how he was instructed to doctor vendor invoices, pad expense reports, and siphon an average of $4 million a quarter into an offshore holding company called Apex Global. A collective murmur erupted from the board members. The numbers were staggering. Brianna's face drained of color. The smug patrician mask was completely gone, replaced by a tight, rigid panic. Arthur Penhaligon is a disgruntled employee. I fired him 3 weeks ago for incompetence. This is a fabricated document to extort me. You fired him because my father started asking him questions before he died, Jack countered, taking a step toward her. My father knew, Brianna. He knew everything. He was just too weak and too heavily medicated by you to fight back openly. But he left me the map. Lies, Brianna screamed, slamming her palms onto the table. I loved Ryland. I am the majority shareholder. I demand this meeting be adjourned immediately. Apex Global, Jack continued, his voice rising above her shouting, echoing with absolute authority. A shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A company wholly owned and operated by a man living in a gated luxury compound in Boca Raton, Florida. A man named Gordon Cross. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was so quiet, Jack could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. Trent frowned, looking back and forth between Jack and his mother. Who the hell is Gordon Cross? Jack slowly reached into the leather bag one final time. He pulled out the blown-up, high-definition surveillance photograph of Brianna standing next to the tanned, smiling man at the private airstrip in Georgia. He tossed it directly into the center of the table, right in front of Trent. Take a good look, Trent, Jack said softly. You have his eyes. Trent stared at the photograph. His eyes traced the face of the man standing intimately with his mother. The confusion on his face slowly morphed into a horrified realization. Gregory? One of the older board members gasped, adjusting his glasses. That's Gregory Collins. But Gregory has been dead for 8 years. Gregory Collins faked his disappearance to avoid an SEC audit that my father was preparing to initiate, Jack stated, pacing slowly around the table like a predator circling its prey. He rebranded himself as Gordon Cross, and for the last 8 years, he and Brianna have been bleeding this company dry, tens of millions of dollars. Stolen from the shareholders, stolen from the employees, and stolen from my father. Mom? Trent whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Brianna. Is that Gregory? Is he alive? Brianna was trapped. The absolute proof was sitting in front of the most powerful men in the company. She looked at the photograph, then at the affidavit, and finally at Jack. The venom in her eyes was toxic. You little bastard, she sneered, dropping the pretense entirely. Her voice dropped an octave, turning cold and vicious. You think you've won? You think a few papers change anything? I control the voting block. I control the board. I will tie this up in litigation for the next 20 years. I will spend every dime of Ryland's money making sure you die in the gutter where you belong. She turned to Franklin Sterling. Franklin, you are my lawyer. Shut this down. Now, Franklin Sterling looked at Brianna, then down at the damning evidence in his hands. He closed the folder. I am the corporate counsel for Stellan Manufacturing, Brianna, Franklin said, his voice remarkably steady, not your personal defense attorney. Given the overwhelming evidence of felony wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy presented here, I have a fiduciary duty to protect the company, not you. Brianna's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. You're turning on me? After everything I've paid you? The board will be immediately suspending your shares pending a full federal investigation, Franklin continued, ignoring her. He looked around the table. All in favor? Every single hand in the room went up. You can't do this, Trent yelled, standing up, his chair crashing backward to the floor. The will gave us the company. It's ours. Actually, Trent, Jack interrupted, leaning forward against the table. According to the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, any assets, properties, or controlling shares acquired through a systemic pattern of wire fraud and embezzlement are subject to immediate federal seizure. Jack checked his watch. It was 9:15 p.m., which is exactly what I explained to the director of the FBI's white-collar crime division when I handed him the digital backups of these files at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Jack said smoothly. Brianna stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the boardroom. You called the FBI? I didn't want to drag this out in civil court for 20 years, Brianna, Jack said, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. I wanted to watch you lose everything. Instantly. Right on cue, the muffled, heavy sound of the executive elevators arriving at the 82nd floor echoed through the lobby. A second later, the glass doors to the boardroom were pushed open violently. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back flooded into the room. They moved with swift, practiced precision. Brianna Carmichael, the lead agent barked, flashing a gold badge. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Hands where I can see them. Brianna didn't fight. The fight had entirely left her. As the agent pulled her arms behind her back and the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, she stared at Jack. There were no tears, only the hollow, empty look of a woman who had spent a decade building a house of cards, only to watch a man she thought was nothing blow it completely away. Mom. Trent panicked, stepping forward. Two agents immediately grabbed him, pushing him against the wall and patting him down. I didn't do anything! I didn't know! Tell them I didn't know! Trent Carmichael, another agent, read from a warrant. We have warrants for your financial records and devices. You're coming with us. Jack stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching impassively as his father's tormentors were marched out of the boardroom in disgrace. The echo of their footsteps faded into the elevators, leaving the room in a stunned, heavy silence. Franklin Sterling let out a long, shaky breath, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at Jack, a new, profound respect and a healthy dose of fear in his eyes. Well, Jack, Franklin said softly, with Brianna's shares seized by the federal government, the estate will enter probate. But given the circumstances and the fraud that nullified her inheritance, control of Stellan Manufacturing will revert entirely to the sole biological heir. Franklin gestured to the empty leather chair at the head of the table, the chair Ryland Stellan had commanded for 30 years. Would you like to sit down, Mr. Stellan? Jack looked at the chair. He thought about the freezing nights in the grocery store parking lot. He thought about his bleeding knuckles hitting the plastic dashboard. And he thought about his father, reaching out from beyond the grave to give him exactly what he needed to survive. Yes, Franklin, Jack said, pulling the chair out and sitting down. I believe I would. 3 months later, Jack Stellan stood in the executive garage of Stellan Manufacturing. The legal battles were swift and brutal. Brianna and Gregory were indicted on 54 federal counts, facing decades behind bars. Trent was stripped of his stolen trust fund and was currently working a minimum wage job while cooperating with federal prosecutors to avoid jail time. The empire was Jack's again, but more importantly, his father's name was cleared. Jack smiled as he walked up to his parking space. The 1989 Chevy Caprice Classic was no longer a rust bucket. It had been meticulously, flawlessly restored. The burgundy paint shined like glass, the chrome bumpers gleamed, and the engine purred with a powerful, perfect rhythm. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a monument to resilience, a reminder that the greatest inheritances aren't handed to us on a silver platter sometimes. We have to dig them out of the wreckage. If you love this story of ultimate revenge, hidden secrets, and reclaiming what is rightfully yours, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a massive plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, drama-filled true stories. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you inherited that broken car?